James had always been a quiet and reserved high school student. He preferred spending his time buried in books, drawing in his sketchpad, or practicing his violin, rather than engaging in the boisterous social activities that most of his peers enjoyed. His delicate frame, introverted nature, and bookish interests made him an easy target for the bullies at Roosevelt High. Every morning, as James walked through the front doors of the school, he would brace himself for the onslaught. It usually started with subtle jabs, snide remarks about his appearance or the way he walked. Mark, the ringleader, was a tall, athletic boy with a penchant for cruelty. He and his friends took sadistic pleasure in tormenting James. In the hallways, they would knock his books out of his hands, trip him, or shove him into lockers. James's heart would pound in his chest as he quickly gathered his things, trying to avoid eye contact and escape further humiliation. Lunchtime was the worst. James would sit alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. Mark and his gang, however, always seemed to find him. They would sit nearby, hurling insults, and sometimes even throwing food at him. Other students would laugh or look away, unwilling to intervene. The cafeteria monitors, often overwhelmed with the chaos of hundreds of teenagers, rarely noticed, and when they did, they would offer only half-hearted reprimands. James tried to seek help. He reported the bullying to his teachers, but they were dismissive. "Boys will be boys," they would say, or, "You need to stand up for yourself, James." The school administration was no better. Meetings with the principal resulted in empty promises and no real action. At home, James's parents were absorbed in their own struggles. His mother worked long hours at a local diner, while his father was often away on business trips. When James tried to explain what he was going through, they brushed it off. "Just ignore them," his mother would say, her eyes tired. "You need to toughen up," his father would add over the phone, his voice distant. The isolation took a toll on James. His grades began to slip, and he found it increasingly difficult to concentrate in class. The relentless bullying gnawed at his self-esteem, making him feel worthless and invisible. The few friends he had distanced themselves, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Nights were the worst. Lying in bed, James would replay the day's events in his mind, feeling the sting of each insult and the pain of each bruise. He would cry silently, burying his face in his pillow to muffle the sound. Weekends offered a brief respite, but even then, the dread of Monday morning loomed over him like a dark cloud. The anxiety was so overwhelming that James often felt physically ill. He would spend hours in his room, drawing or playing the violin, trying to lose himself in his art and music. But the looming specter of school always pulled him back to reality. Despite his attempts to endure and stay out of trouble, the bullying only seemed to escalate. Mark and his friends became more brazen, their attacks more vicious. One afternoon, after gym class, they cornered James in the locker room. They taunted him, shoving him back and forth like a rag doll. Mark took it a step further, ripping James's shirt and throwing his clothes into the showers, turning the water on. James stood there, shivering and humiliated, as they laughed and left him to clean up the mess. As James sat on the cold locker room bench, tears streaming down his face, he felt a deep sense of hopelessness. He realized that no one was coming to help him. The teachers, the administrators, even his parents, none of them understood the depth of his pain. He was alone in this struggle, and the weight of it was crushing him. The seeds of desperation began to take root in his mind. He started to believe that the only way to end his suffering was to take matters into his own hands. As the weeks turned into months, the bullying continued unabated, and James's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He became a ghost of his former self, moving through the days in a daze, disconnected from the world around him. The once vibrant sketches in his notebook turned dark and disturbing, filled with images of pain and revenge. His music, too, took on a somber tone, the haunting melodies reflecting the turmoil within him. James's academic performance plummeted. He found it nearly impossible to focus on his studies, his mind constantly replaying the humiliations he endured daily. The anxiety gnawed at him, manifesting in sleepless nights and constant fatigue. His parents, already distant, grew more concerned with his declining grades and reclusive behavior, but their attempts to reach out were clumsy and ineffective. They still failed to grasp the severity of the situation, attributing his troubles to typical teenage angst. One day the bullying reached a new level of cruelty. Mark and his gang decided to make an example of James in front of the entire school. It was a chilly November morning, and the students were gathered outside for a fire drill. As they stood in their designated spots, waiting for the all-clear signal, Mark and his friends approached James. With swift, practiced motions, they yanked his backpack from his shoulders and dumped its contents onto the ground. Pens, notebooks, and personal items scattered across the wet grass, drawing the attention of nearby students. James bent down to gather his belongings, his cheeks burning with shame. But Mark wasn't done. He grabbed James by the collar and pulled him up, shoving him against the brick wall of the school building. "Everyone, check this out," Mark shouted, his voice echoing across the courtyard. The crowd turned to watch, their curiosity piqued. With a malicious grin, Mark produced a permanent marker from his pocket and began scribbling on James's forehead. "Loser," he wrote, the black ink stark against James's pale skin. The laughter that erupted from the crowd was deafening. James stood there, frozen, his humiliation complete. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The fire drill ended, and the students were herded back inside. James, his face still marked, kept his head down, trying to avoid the stares and whispers. He retreated to the bathroom, where he scrubbed at his forehead with paper towels and soap, but the ink wouldn't come off. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, his eyes filled with despair. How had it come to this? How much more could he endure? That evening, James sat alone in his room, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. He tried to lose himself in his drawings, but the images that emerged were filled with violence and darkness. His violin lay untouched in the corner, the strings silent. He felt an overwhelming sense of anger and frustration, a burning desire for retribution. As he lay in bed, unable to sleep, James's thoughts turned to the knives in the kitchen drawer. He imagined what it would feel like to hold one in his hand, to have that sense of power and control. The idea terrified him, but it also brought a twisted sense of comfort. He began to fantasize about confronting Mark and his friends, making them feel a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on him. The next day at school, James felt a strange sense of detachment. He moved through the hallways like a spectator, observing the interactions around him without truly engaging. Mark and his gang continued their torment, but their words seemed to bounce off him. He had become numb to their cruelty, his mind focused on a single chilling thought. He needed to do something to stop this. James's fantasies of revenge grew more vivid and detailed. He began to plan, mapping out scenarios in his mind. He envisioned confronting his tormentors in a way that would leave a lasting impact, something that would make them understand the depth of his suffering. The idea of violence became an obsession, a dark cloud that overshadowed his every thought. In his darkest moments, James started to gather supplies. He took note of the times and places where he could confront Mark and his friends without interference. He stole a knife from the kitchen, hiding it in his backpack. The weight of it was a constant reminder of his plans, both a source of fear and a twisted comfort. James' behavior became increasingly erratic, but no one seemed to notice. His teachers were too busy with their own responsibilities, his parents too absorbed in their own lives. His few remaining friends had drifted away, unable to deal with the intensity of his anger and despair. He was truly alone, left to navigate the storm of his emotions without guidance or support. As the day of reckoning approached, James's resolve hardened. He felt a cold, calm determination, a sense of inevitability. The bullying had stripped away his humanity, leaving him with a raw, primal need for retribution. He knew that his actions would have consequences, but he didn't care. He had reached his breaking point, and there was no turning back. The fateful day arrived with an eerie stillness. James woke up early, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his chest. The house was quiet, his parents still asleep. He moved mechanically, his actions driven by a sense of grim determination. The knife, carefully concealed in his backpack, felt heavier than ever. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. Its presence was etched into his mind. James walked to school, his senses heightened. The world around him seemed sharper, more vivid, as if he was seeing everything for the last time. The trees lining the street, the distant hum of traffic, the morning light casting long shadows, all of it felt significant, laden with meaning. He arrived at school early, slipping into the building unnoticed. He headed straight to his locker, taking a moment to steady himself. As the first bell rang, students began to fill the hallways. James blended into the crowd, his expression blank. He moved through his morning classes like a ghost, his mind focused on the confrontation he had meticulously planned. The hours passed in a blur, the routine of the school day a surreal backdrop to the storm brewing within him. Lunchtime arrived, and with it the usual dread. James made his way to the cafeteria, knowing that Mark and his gang would be waiting for him. The noise and chaos of the room felt distant, muted, as he walked to his usual spot. Sure enough, Mark was there, flanked by his friends, their faces twisted with the familiar smirks of disdain. James felt his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. He sat down, trying to remain calm, but the tension was unbearable. Mark wasted no time, launching into his usual tirade of insults. The words washed over James, barely registering. He reached into his backpack, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the knife. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity. Suddenly, everything snapped into focus. James stood up abruptly, the knife clutched in his hand. The cafeteria fell silent, a collective gasp rippling through the room. Mark's smirk faltered, confusion and fear flickering across his face. James felt a surge of power, a sense of control he hadn't felt in months. He stepped forward, his voice steady and cold, though no words were spoken. The next moments were a blur of motion and chaos. Students screamed, tables overturned, the sound of panicked footsteps echoing off the walls. James felt detached, as if he was watching himself from a distance. He moved with purpose, his actions deliberate. Mark tried to back away, but there was no escape. The knife found its mark, a flash of red against the dull backdrop of the cafeteria. Everything happened so quickly. Teachers rushed in, their faces masks of shock and horror. James was wrestled to the ground, the knife slipping from his grasp. He didn't resist. He had no fight left in him. The world around him dissolved into a cacophony of noise and confusion. Sirens wailed in the distance, the sound growing louder with each passing second. As he was led away in handcuffs, James felt a strange sense of calm. The rage that had consumed him was gone, replaced by an empty numbness. He glanced back at the cafeteria, at the faces of his classmates frozen in shock and fear. He had made his statement, but the cost was unimaginable. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing realization of what he had done. James was taken to a holding cell, the cold metal bars a stark contrast to the chaos of the cafeteria. He sat there, alone, his mind racing. The enormity of his actions began to sink in, the reality of the consequences he would face. He thought about his parents, about the pain and shame they would endure. He thought about Mark and the irreversible damage he had caused. There was no going back, no way to undo what had been done. The hours passed slowly, each minute dragging on as James awaited his fate. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a deep sense of regret and sorrow. The anger that had driven him to this point was gone, leaving behind only a void. He had wanted to end his torment, to make his tormentors understand his pain. But in doing so, he had lost everything. The door to his cell creaked open, and a police officer stepped inside. James was led out, his steps heavy. He was escorted to an interrogation room, where 2 detectives waited. Their faces were stern, their questions relentless. James answered mechanically, his voice flat. He recounted the months of bullying, the isolation, the desperation. He spoke of the breaking point, the moment he had decided to take matters into his own hands. The detectives listened, their expressions unreadable. They asked about the knife, about the planning, about his state of mind. James answered truthfully, laying bare the darkness that had consumed him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but there was no point in hiding anymore. The truth was out, and he had to face the consequences. As the interrogation came to an end, James was led back to his cell. He felt a crushing weight of guilt and sorrow, a profound sadness for what he had done. He thought about his parents, about the shame they would face. He thought about Mark, about the life he had taken. The future stretched out before him, bleak and uncertain. The next few days were a blur of legal proceedings, meetings with lawyers, and visits from his parents. They were devastated, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. James tried to explain, but there were no words that could make it right. The bond between them, already strained, was shattered beyond repair. He was left to navigate the aftermath alone, the weight of his actions a constant burden. James sat in his cell, the days blending together. He thought about the future, about the life he had thrown away. The regret was overwhelming, a constant ache in his chest. He had wanted to end his suffering, but he had only created more pain. The school, the community, his family, everyone was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered world. The days following the tragic incident at the school were marked by a somber silence that seemed to hang over the entire community. News of the violent act spread quickly, casting a pall over the town. The school, once a bustling hub of teenage energy, now felt like a place of mourning. Students and teachers alike were grappling with the shock and horror of what had happened, each trying to make sense of the senseless violence that had shattered their world. James' parents were in a state of profound grief and disbelief. They spent hours at the courthouse and in meetings with lawyers, their lives turned upside down by the actions of their son. The community, once their support network, now seemed to look at them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They were ostracized, their social circles shrinking as friends and neighbors distanced themselves. It was as if they were being punished for James's actions, left to bear the brunt of the community's anger and sorrow. The school held a memorial service for Mark, the student whose life had been cut short. The gymnasium was filled with students, teachers, and grieving parents, all gathered to remember the boy they had lost. Photographs of Mark lined the walls, capturing moments of his life that now seemed unbearably precious. The principal spoke, his voice trembling as he tried to find words of comfort and solidarity. Mark's parents sat in the front row, their faces etched with pain. The service was meant to bring the community together, but it only served to highlight the deep wounds that had been inflicted. James, meanwhile, was in juvenile detention, awaiting his trial. The stark reality of his situation weighed heavily on him. The days were long and monotonous, filled with counseling sessions, legal consultations, and the oppressive silence of his cell. He had plenty of time to reflect on his actions, and the remorse he felt was overwhelming. He thought about Mark, about his parents, and about the life he had irrevocably changed. The rage that had driven him to violence had burned out, leaving only a deep, hollow emptiness in its place. James's trial was a grueling ordeal. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and the families of both James and Mark. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer, while the defense tried to explain the months of bullying and torment that had driven James to his breaking point. Witnesses were called, including students and teachers who recounted the events leading up to the tragedy. Each testimony felt like a knife to James's already wounded soul, a reminder of the pain he had caused. The verdict, when it came, was not a surprise. James was found guilty of manslaughter. The sentence was harsh, reflecting the severity of his crime and the need for justice for Mark and his family. As the judge read the sentence, James felt a sense of finality, a grim acknowledgement of the path his life had taken. He was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with every step. The community continued to reel from the tragedy. The school implemented new anti-bullying programs and increased security measures, but the atmosphere remained tense and somber. Students struggled to focus on their studies, haunted by the memory of what had happened. Teachers found it difficult to maintain a sense of normalcy, their own grief and fear lingering just beneath the surface. Mark's parents tried to move forward, but their lives were forever changed. They attended support groups and counseling sessions, seeking solace in the company of others who had experienced similar losses. Their home, once filled with laughter and life, was now a place of quiet sorrow. They kept Mark's room just as it had been, a shrine to the son they had lost. James's parents were left to navigate their own grief and guilt. They visited him regularly, trying to maintain a connection despite the physical and emotional distance. Each visit was a painful reminder of the boy they had raised and the man he had become. They struggled with feelings of anger, sadness, and helplessness, knowing that their family would never be the same. As time passed, the raw edges of the community's grief began to dull, but the scars remained. The memory of that tragic day lingered, a painful reminder of the consequences of unchecked cruelty and desperation. The story of James and Mark became a cautionary tale, a stark example of how easily a life can be shattered by violence and the ripple effects that spread through a community in its aftermath. The school, the town, and the families involved were left to pick up the pieces, each struggling to find a way forward in a world irrevocably altered by tragedy. Years passed, but the tragedy that occurred at the school continued to cast a long shadow over the community. The memories of that fateful day faded with time, but the repercussions were felt in the lives of everyone connected to the event. James' life in incarceration. James served his sentence in a juvenile detention center before being transferred to an adult facility. The years in detention were harsh, marked by a relentless struggle to come to terms with his actions. He participated in various rehabilitation programs, attended therapy sessions, and pursued his education. Despite his efforts, the stigma of his crime followed him everywhere. The label of a killer was a heavy burden to bear, one that made it difficult for him to forge meaningful relationships or envision a future beyond the prison walls. Occasionally, James would receive letters from his parents, filled with updates about their lives and expressions of their enduring love. These letters were a lifeline, offering a small measure of hope and a reminder that he was not entirely alone. However, each letter also carried a reminder of the pain he had caused, making it hard for him to fully embrace their support. James's parents' struggle. James's parents remained deeply affected by the incident. They had moved to a new town, seeking a fresh start away from the judgment and whispers of their old community. Despite the change in scenery, the grief and guilt remained constant companions. They continued to visit James regularly, their lives revolving around the routine of prison visits. Each trip was emotionally exhausting, but they were determined to stand by their son. In their new community, they kept a low profile, avoiding discussions about their past. The weight of their son's actions and the impact on their family was a secret they carried with them, shaping their interactions and limiting their social connections. The once vibrant couple had become shadows of their former selves, their lives defined by the tragedy they could never escape. Mark's family and their pain. Mark's family, too, was irrevocably changed. His parents struggled to move forward, their home a constant reminder of the son they had lost. They became advocates for anti-bullying campaigns, channeling their grief into efforts to prevent similar tragedies. They spoke at schools, organized support groups, and worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the devastating effects of bullying. Despite their efforts, the pain of their loss was ever present. Their marriage, strained by the weight of their grief, eventually fell apart. They remained united in their advocacy work, but the personal toll was immense. Each anniversary of Mark's death brought a renewed wave of sorrow, a reminder of the life that had been stolen from them. The school community's transformation. At the school, the administration implemented extensive changes to address bullying and promote mental health. New policies were put in place, and counselors were made available to students in need. The tragedy had forced a reckoning, leading to a more vigilant and supportive environment. However, the memory of the violent act lingered. Students who had been at the school during the incident carried the trauma with them, affecting their academic performance and social interactions. The school's reputation suffered, and it took years to rebuild trust with the community. Reflecting on the tragedy. As the years went by, the town slowly began to heal. New students arrived, unaware of the tragedy that had once defined the school. The physical reminders of that day, such as the gymnasium where the memorial service had been held, remained, but the emotional wounds gradually began to close. James, now a young man, continued to serve his sentence. The lessons he had learned about the consequences of violence and the importance of addressing mental health issues were hard-earned. He had become a mentor to younger inmates, sharing his story in the hope of preventing others from making similar mistakes. Despite the bleakness of his situation, he held on to a sliver of hope that one day he might find redemption. Mark's family remained dedicated to their cause, their advocacy work serving as both a tribute to their son and a means of coping with their loss. The community, while forever changed, had grown stronger and more aware, united in the shared goal of ensuring that such a tragedy would never happen again. In the end, the story of James and Mark was a powerful reminder of the fragility of life and the profound impact of our actions. The town, the school, and the families involved were left to navigate a world forever altered by a moment of desperation and violence. Their lives intertwined by a shared tragedy that would never be forgotten.